Great geographical discoveries. In the 15th century, Europe was going through a major shift. The Middle Ages were slowly fading away, and the Renaissance was starting. Cities were growing, trade was picking up, and monarchies were strengthening their power. But the main driver of change was trade routes. Eastern goods, spices, silk, and precious stones were essential to Europe. Pepper was valued almost as much as gold, and without it, it was impossible to preserve food. Sugar, cinnamon, and nutmeg were considered luxuries available only to the wealthy. Until the 15th century, the route to Asia went through the Middle East. Caravans delivered goods from India and China to the ports of the Mediterranean Sea. But in 1453, disaster struck, Constantinople fell, and the Ottoman Empire blocked the old routes. Europe found itself cut off from the East. Spice prices skyrocketed, and trade became dependent on the Turks. This forced people to look for new routes. Two directions seemed possible: to circumnavigate Africa and reach India by sea, or to sail west across the Atlantic, hoping to reach Asia by another route. Portugal and Spain became the leaders. By the 15th century, the Portuguese were already actively exploring the coast of Africa. Henry the Navigator founded navigation schools and sent expeditions further and further south. Spain, which had united after the Reconquista and the fall of Granada in 1492, was also ready for great achievements. Names that were destined to go down in history appeared on the horizon: Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan. Their voyages changed the map of the world and the fate of humanity. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa around 1451 into the family of a weaver named Domenico Colombo. He came from a modest background, but from a young age he was drawn to the sea. As a teenager, he took part in trading voyages and later ended up in Portugal, the leading maritime power of the time. In Portugal, he married Filipa Moniz Perez, the daughter of the governor of Madeira. Thanks to this marriage, Columbus gained access to maps and maritime archives. He read extensively about Marco Polo's travels, the land of Cathay, China, and the islands of Zipangu, Japan. In the 15th century, most educated people knew that the Earth was spherical. But its size was a matter of debate. Columbus was convinced that the distance from Europe to Asia across the Atlantic was not great. He was wrong. In reality, the ocean was many times wider. But it was this mistake that gave him confidence in his plan. Columbus first approached the Portuguese king, João II. But Portugal already had its own plan to circumnavigate Africa. Therefore, Columbus was refused. He then turned to Spain. At the end of the 15th century, Spain was completing the Reconquista. In January 1492, the last Muslim stronghold in the Pyrenees, Granada, fell. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile became the rulers of the United Kingdom and sought new ways to strengthen their power and wealth. After lengthy negotiations, Columbus obtained their consent. He was promised the title of Admiral of the Ocean and the right to rule the lands he would discover. In the summer of 1492, a small fleet left the port of Palos, the Santa Maria, the flagship, the Pinta, and the Nina. There were about 90 people on board. Most of the sailors were ordinary residents of Andalusia, and the officers were people who trusted Columbus. The voyage proved to be difficult. Months on the open ocean caused fear. The sailors feared that the winds would not allow them to return. In early October, discontent arose among the crew, threatening to turn into a mutiny. But Columbus maintained discipline, promising that land was near. On the night of October 12, 1492, sailor Rodrigo de Triana shouted from the deck of the Pinta that land was ahead. In the morning, the ships reached an island in the Bahamas archipelago. Columbus named it San Salvador. Columbus was convinced that he had discovered the edge of Asia. He called the local inhabitants Indios, Indians. During the voyage, the expedition reached Cuba and Hispaniola, Haiti. The first colony, La Navidad, was built there. Columbus left some of his men there and returned to Spain with 2 ships. In Europe, he was welcomed as a hero. He was given new funds for expeditions. Columbus made a total of 4 voyages. He explored the Caribbean Sea, the coast of Central America, and even reached the mouth of the Orinoco River in South America. But until the end of his life, he was convinced that he had reached Asia. His fate was tragic. The administration of the colonies was accompanied by cruelty and disorder. In 1500, he was arrested and sent to Spain in chains. Although he was acquitted, he lost his titles and some of his rights. Christopher Columbus died in 1506 in Valladolid. He never knew that he had discovered a new continent. Only later did Amerigo Vespucci prove that it was the New World, a separate part of the world unknown to the ancients. Columbus' discovery was a turning point in history. Europe gained a new world to colonize, while for the indigenous peoples of America, a tragic era of conquest began. At the end of the 15th century, Portugal became the leading maritime power in Europe. Thanks to the efforts of Prince Henry, known as the Navigator, the Portuguese explored the west coast of Africa. They discovered the Azores, Madeira, and reached the Gulf of Guinea. Their main goals were gold, ivory, and, most importantly, a route to India. Eastern spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, were worth a fortune. Until then, they had been traded through Arab intermediaries and Venice. But Portugal dreamed of gaining direct access to the source of these riches. Preparing for the expedition. In 1497, King Manuel I commissioned Vasco da Gama to lead an expedition to India. Vasco came from a noble but not wealthy family. He was a naval officer, had experience sailing along Africa, and enjoyed the king's trust. The expedition consisted of 4 ships, the São Gabriel, flagship, the São Rafael, the Berrio, and a supply ship. The crew numbered about 170 people. There were also interpreters, scribes, and priests on board. In the summer of 1497, the fleet left Lisbon. The ships rounded the Canary Islands and headed for southern Africa. The journey around Africa. The journey proved to be long and arduous. The ships crossed the Atlantic and passed the Cape of Good Hope, previously discovered by Bartholomew Diaz. Then began the uncharted journey along the east coast of Africa. Vasco da Gama called at the ports of Mozambique, Mombasa, and Malindi. There he encountered Arab merchants who controlled trade in the Indian Ocean. They were distrustful of the Portuguese, often hostile. In Malindi, da Gama hired an experienced Arab pilot, Ahmed ibn Majid, who knew the monsoons and sea routes. Thanks to this guide, the Portuguese were able to cross the Indian Ocean. Arrival in India. In May 1498, the fleet reached the city of Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. It was one of the largest trading centers of Malabar. Spices, fabrics, and jewels were traded here. The meeting proved to be difficult. Local rulers were strongly influenced by Arab merchants, who saw the Portuguese as dangerous competitors. Vasco da Gama was received by the ruler, but the gifts he brought seemed pitiful compared to the wealth of the Indian markets. Nevertheless, the very fact that the Portuguese had reached India by sea was a sensation. The expedition returned home with a cargo of pepper and cinnamon. Despite the difficulties, the profits were enormous. The return journey was even more difficult. Disease, storms, and exhausting voyages claimed the lives of many sailors. Of the 4 ships, only 2 returned to Portugal, and only half of the crew. In 1499, Vasco da Gama returned to Lisbon. He was welcomed as a hero. King Manuel I awarded him titles and rich gifts. Second voyage. In 1502, da Gama led a new expedition, this time a military one. He arrived in India with 20 ships. This time, the Portuguese acted harshly. They captured Arab ships, bombarded cities, and demanded trade privileges. These bloody methods brought success. The Portuguese established themselves in Calicut and built their first trading posts. The formation of Portuguese India, a colonial empire in the Indian Ocean, began. The legacy of Vasco da Gama. The discovery of the sea route to India was one of the most important events in world history. It changed trade. Europeans gained direct access to the riches of the East. Venice and Arab intermediaries lost their monopoly. Portugal became the first global empire. Its ships ruled the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and even reached China and Japan. Vasco da Gama died in 1524 in India while serving as governor. His name has forever remained a symbol of the age of discovery. In the second half of the 1490s, Europe was living in a new reality. Columbus returned with tales of the West Indies, Portugal was rushing to India around Africa, and Spain was establishing itself in the Caribbean. To avoid conflict, the two crowns signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494 along a meridian approximately 370 leagues west of Cape Verde. The world was divided into spheres, everything to the west went to Castile, everything to the east to Portugal. The formula was elegant, but it concealed a time bomb. No one knew the actual size of the Earth, no one knew how to measure longitude at sea, and there was no agreed border on the other side of the meridian. This is where the Florentine Amerigo Vespucci enters the scene. Born in the 1450s into a family of notaries, he served the House of Medici, was knowledgeable about trade and accounting, and made a career in Seville with the Medici agency that supplied Castilian expeditions. He was not a heroic captain in the Homeric sense, but a practical expert in navigational instruments, maps, and markets. But it was his pen and his observations that helped Europe understand that Columbus had stumbled upon not the edge of Asia, but an unknown continent. Vespucci's voyages are still debated today. Modern historians agree that two of them are reliable: the Spanish voyage of 1499 to 1500 as part of Alonso de Ojeda's expedition, which sailed along the coast of present-day Venezuela and to the mouth of the Orinoco, and the Portuguese voyage of 1501 to 1502 with Goncalves Coelho, who surveyed the coast of Brazil far to the south. The other two voyages described in later editions of his letters are considered dubious. But what is more important for history is that Vespucci carefully recorded latitudes using the sun, described the currents of rivers, winds, and coasts, and came to a conclusion that turned the familiar picture of the world upside down. The Spanish expedition of 1499 began in the southern Caribbean. The caravels sailed along a flat coastline dotted with villages built on stilts, which led the Spaniards to nickname the bay Venezuela, or Little Venice. Vespucci saw the main argument for the new continent at Golfo de Paria. The fresh water of the Orinoco diluted the sea so powerfully that it could only have come from a huge landmass with a colossal river system. He wrote, "These are not islands, but solid land, tierra firme." The Portuguese voyage of 1501 to 1502 had a different goal. After the accidental discovery of Brazil by Pedro Álvares Cabral, 1500, Lisbon wanted to understand what kind of coast it was, how far it stretched, and whether it fell within Portugal's sphere according to the Treaty of Tordesillas. The fleet of Coelho and Vespucci, moving along the coast and naming the bays after saints in the calendar, sailed far south to the Tropic of Capricorn and, according to some sources, to latitudes where the cold current warms up and the coast turns southeast. The overly long front of the Lasian Peninsula did not fit in with the old geography. Upon his return, Vespucci wrote two letters that spread throughout Europe, Mundus Novus and Letter to Soderini. They differ in details and chronology, but carry the same message: we have not found India, but a new world, Novus Mundus. This formula proved stronger than all the royal decrees. Cartographers, humanists, and university circles received intellectual justification for cutting the globe anew. The result was the 1502 map, Cantino's Planisphere, derived from the Portuguese secret map collection. It clearly shows the protrusion of the Brazilian coast. The next big step was taken by a circle in the town of Saint-Die in Lorraine, the humanists Ringman and Waldseemüller. In 1507, they published universal cosmography with a huge wall map, where the southern part of the western continent was named America for the first time, after the man who discovered it, Amerigo. They were mistaken in their prerogatives. Columbus had set foot there earlier. But the name stuck. It was short, convenient, and backed up by new logic. Waldseemüller later had second thoughts and removed the caption in one of the editions, but it was too late. America had already made its way into engravers' workshops and navigation textbooks. At the same time, the practice of navigation was changing. Pilots of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans learned to confidently determine latitude by the noon altitude of the sun, using an astrolabe and a cross staff, capturing the shadow on the scale, but they still did not know how to measure longitude for another 2 centuries. Therefore, decisions were made based on a navigational intuition, calculating course and speed, using a compass, stars, and the experience of the Volta du Mar, the very reverse arc across the open spaces of the ocean, where the trade winds and westerlies themselves pushed the ship forward. Vespucci went from being a civil servant and provisioner to becoming the royal cosmographer. In 1508, he was appointed chief navigator of Castile. He was to teach pilots and maintain padrones, reference maps and pilot books. His name became a symbol not so much of being the first to set foot on shore as of a shift in thinking. The world was bigger than ancient books had imagined, and the West was a new continent. There is also a dark side to this story. Mahogany, paints, and plants flooded into Europe from the west, while iron, the cross, and disease flooded in from the east. The first Spanish settlements on Hispaniola showed the terrible arithmetic of contact. Smallpox, measles, and typhus took the lives of tens of thousands of Indians who had no immunity. But this tragedy is part of the next chapter, because soon people will appear on the scene for whom the ocean is not just a route, but a new empire. First, however, we need to circle the entire Earth to see its size through the eyes of those who first sailed across 2 oceans in a row. Ferdinand Magellan was born in Portugal in the 1480s, served in the East, fought off the coast of India, in Malacca, and off the coast of Morocco. He was a Portuguese officer, knew the ports of the Indian Ocean, knew the price of spices and the weak points of the sea winds. After falling out with King Manuel I, he took a step that was considered treason in Lisbon. He offered his project to Castile. The idea was simple and bold. If Tordesillas divided the world along one meridian, then somewhere on the other side there must be a mirror border. If you approached the Moluccas, Tembal, Ternate, Tidor, from the west, you could prove that they lay within the Spanish sphere. In 1519, the Spanish crown trusted the Portuguese. 5 ships departed from Seville, the flagship Trinidad, San Anton, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago, with about 260 people, half Spanish, half Portuguese and foreigners. At the helm were experienced pilots. In the cabins were priests and scribes, among them the Venetian Antonio Pigafetta, who would leave a detailed diary. The Atlantic crossing was familiar, the Canary Islands, the coast of Brazil, and further south, the deserted, windy coast of Patagonia. There, in San Julian Bay, the fleet spent the winter, and it was there that hidden cracks began to appear. Some of the captains rebelled. They did not trust the stranger and feared the unknown sea beyond the south. Magellan acted ruthlessly, an armed raid on the rebellious caravels, a trial, the execution of the leaders, and the landing of the dissenters on shore. One ship, the Santiago, was wrecked in a storm while on reconnaissance. The remaining 4, disciplined with an iron fist, continued south until the coast diverged, revealing a long, winding, crooked channel between the mountains and the ice. This was the strait that would later be named after Magellan. Inside it, the ships trudged for weeks, maneuvering between the tides, rocks, and black blizzards, setting landmarks and recording bays. At one point, the San Anton escaped. It turned back and sailed to Spain. Fear and hunger proved stronger than the oath. The remaining 3 ships, Trinidad, Victoria, and Concepcion, sailed into the radiance of other waters. The ocean was so calm and boundless that it was recorded as Mare Pacificum, the Pacific. The crossing of the Pacific Ocean became the most terrible ordeal of the entire expedition. Weeks turned into months. The sails and rigging deteriorated, the water barrels soured, the ship's rats were caught and eaten, and scurvy mowed down the men. Without fresh greens, their teeth loosened, their gums bled, and their bodies weakened. There were no large islands, only rare atolls with no water. It was not until March 1521 that the shores of Guam appeared, the islands of thieves, as the Europeans recorded, annoyed by how skillfully the locals took tackle from the ships. Behind them lay the Philippine Islands, where everything changed dramatically: water, fish, coconuts, villages, rulers ready for alliances, gifts, and crosses. On Cebu, Magellan baptized Chief Humabon and some of his people. But interfering in the inter-island wars proved to be a fatal mistake. On neighboring Mactan, another chief, Lapu-Lapu, refused to recognize the new ally. Magellan landed with a dozen armored men, hoping to break the resistance by example, and underestimated the shallow water and the number of enemies. The Spaniards were bogged down, their arquebuses useless when spears closed the distance and shields and darts flew one after another. Magellan fell on the shoals, surrounded by warriors. His body was never returned. It seemed that the mission was over. But the logic of the sea and the will of a few officers made the impossible possible. After further losses, some of the men died in ambushes, some were executed by the locals, the squadron reduced itself to a minimum, the Concepcion was burned so as not to stretch the crew. Of the two ships, only the Trinidad and the Victoria remained. They reached the Moluccas, loaded their holds with cloves and nutmeg, the spices for which the whole venture had been conceived. Then the Trinidad attempted to return eastward to Panama, but ran into storms and fell into the hands of the Portuguese. The Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, decided to sail west, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, to a place where the Portuguese had been ordered not to let the Castilians go. It was a race of attrition, bypassing Portuguese bases, sailing into the ocean wilderness, conserving water and bread. Through storms at the Cape and hunger off the coast of Africa, the Victoria entered San Lucar de Barrameda in September 1522. On board were 18 emaciated people out of the nearly 300 who had set sail 3 years earlier. The cloves and nutmeg in the hold paid for the entire expedition, so high were European prices for spices. But something else was more important. For the first time, a European ship had circumnavigated the globe. Magellan and Elcano's circumnavigation of the globe revealed several simple yet alarming truths to the world. First, the Earth is large, much larger than it was depicted in classrooms. Simply crossing the Pacific meant enduring months of emptiness. Second, time on Earth stumbles. Upon their return, the explorers discovered a one-day discrepancy with the Seville calendar, which gave rise to the idea of the date line. Third, Tordesillas did not resolve the main issue, where the antimeridian dividing line on the other side was located. The Spanish and Portuguese would only settle this dispute in 1529 with the Treaty of Zaragoza. The Moluccas would be recognized as Portuguese territory, Castile would receive compensation, and turn its attention to Mexico and Peru, where silver and gold lay instead of spices. Magellan's expedition did not discover an easy Spanish route to spices. Portugal had a firm hold on the Indian Ocean. But it gave European cartography facts that could no longer be ignored. The world is one, the oceans are connected, and the west coast is not the edge of Asia, but vast lands that will soon become the destination of new expeditions. The next page of this story was destined to be stained with blood. A man named Hernan Cortés would appear in the Caribbean Sea and the Mexican highlands, and Francisco Pizarro in the Andes. Their path was not one of geography, but of conquest. At the beginning of the 16th century, Spain established itself in the Caribbean Sea. Cuba and Hispaniola became bases for new expeditions. Plantations grew there, gold was mined, but rumors of rich empires on the mainland stirred the imagination. Hernan Cortés was born in 1485 in Extremadura to a poor noble family. He went to the New World in his youth and settled in Cuba, where he proved himself to be an intelligent and decisive man. In 1519, he received permission to lead an expedition to the coast of Mexico. With a detachment of only 500 men, 16 horses, and several cannons, Cortés landed on the shore. He quickly realized that diplomacy would be the key to success. The Indian tribes hated the rule of the Aztecs, who demanded tribute and human sacrifices. Cortés managed to win them over to his side. His acquaintance with a young woman named Malinche was significant. She knew the Mayan and Nahuatl languages and became Cortés' translator, advisor, and lover. Thanks to her, the conquistador understood the politics and intrigues of the local chiefs. Cortés moved towards the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. The city was breathtaking, huge, built on islands in the middle of a lake, with temples and markets and a system of canals. According to the Spaniards, it was no less beautiful than the largest cities in Europe. The Aztec ruler Montezuma II welcomed Cortés with honors. There is a version that he considered the Spaniards to be messengers of the gods. The Spaniards settled in the city, but soon relations became tense. Cortés arrested Montezuma, effectively turning him into a hostage. When a rebellion broke out in the city, the Spaniards found themselves trapped. On the night of June 30 to July 1, 1520, they attempted to escape. This event went down in history as the Night of Sorrows. Many Spaniards died, drowning in the lake under the weight of the gold they were trying to carry away. Cortés managed to gather his forces. With his Indian allies, he laid siege to Tenochtitlan. The battle lasted for months. The diseases brought by the Europeans played a fatal role. Smallpox decimated the city's population. In 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The Aztec Empire was destroyed. The Spaniards destroyed the temples and built churches in their place. Mexico City, the capital of New Spain, arose on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Cortés became a hero in Spain, but his authority in the colony was constantly challenged by officials. Nevertheless, his conquest marked the beginning of a new era, European expansion into the continent. In the south of South America, there was another great empire, the Inca Empire. It stretched along the Andes from Ecuador to Chile. Its capital was Cusco, and its population exceeded millions. The Incas had a developed road system, terraced agriculture, and strong government. But by the 1530s, the country was embroiled in a civil war between the brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar. Francisco Pizarro, like Cortés, came from a poor family in Extremadura. He arrived in the New World in his youth and participated in campaigns in Panama. Hearing about the rich empire in the south, he decided to take a chance. In 1532, Pizarro crossed the Andes with a detachment of 180 men and 27 horses and arrived in the city of Cajamarca. There was Atahualpa, who had defeated his brother and become the supreme ruler. Pizarro invited him to a meeting. The Incas came unarmed, considering the Spaniards to be a strange but harmless people. At the decisive moment, the Spaniards attacked. Cannons, guns, and horses caused panic. Thousands of Indians died, and Atahualpa himself was captured. The ruler offered a ransom to fill a room with gold and silver. The Spaniards accepted, but then executed him. Soon after, Pizarro entered Cusco and declared the country a possession of Spain. The Inca Empire collapsed. On its ruins, the Spaniards founded the Viceroyalty of Peru. Pizarro's own fate ended tragically. In 1541, he was killed in Lima during a rebellion by his opponents. But his conquest made Spain the richest power in Europe. The discoveries of the 15th and 16th centuries changed the world. Gold and silver flowed from America to Europe. From Bolivia alone, tons of silver were exported annually from the mines of Potosi. It enriched Spain, but caused inflation and economic crises. Along with riches, new crops came to Europe: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cocoa, and tobacco. These plants changed agriculture and nutrition. Iron, weapons, horses, cattle, and diseases went the other way. Smallpox, measles, and influenza killed millions of Native Americans who had no immunity. Soon, the transatlantic slave trade began. Africans were brought to plantations in America. This became one of the darkest chapters in world history. Portugal and Spain divided the world. England, France, and Holland followed suit. The era of colonial empires and global trade began. Great geographical discoveries connected the world into a single network. Europe gained wealth and knowledge, Asia gained new partners and enemies, Africa suffered the tragedy of the slave trade, and America suffered the catastrophe of conquest. The world map changed. Old books ceased to be authoritative. Instead of myths about wonderful islands, real maps and pilot books appeared. Europe's economy moved to a new level. Trade with the East and America made it the center of the world system. The era of capitalism and the bourgeoisie began. Discoveries gave impetus to science. Geography, astronomy, shipbuilding, and cartography developed at an unprecedented rate. But at the same time, the world faced the cruelty of colonialism, exploitation, and the destruction of entire peoples. Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Cortés, Pizarro, their names have gone down in history. Their voyages opened up new lands, connected oceans and continents, and created the modern world. It was an era of heroism and greed, faith and betrayal, great discoveries and great tragedies. An era that made the world global and forever changed the fate of humanity.